hereby call this meeting of Norwood City Council to order. Please rise for the invocation and Pledge of Allegiance. This evening, Pastor Ryan Zong, the New City Presbyterian Church, will give the invocation. Pastor.
Good evening. My name is Ryan from New City Church.
Psalm 127 says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain." So you join me in prayer. Dear God, we are gathered here because we believe that we are called together into a work we cannot yet know the fullness of. Still, we trust the voice of the one who has called us. And so we offer to you, O God, these things, our dreams, our plans, our vision. Shape them as you will, our moments and our gifts. May they be invested toward bright, eternal ends. You alone, O God, by your gracious and life-giving Spirit, have power to knit our imperfect hearts, our weaknesses, our strengths, our stories, and our gifts one to another. May our acts of service and creation, frail and wanting as they are, be met and multiplied by the mysterious workings of your Spirit, who weaves all things together toward a redemption more good and glorious than we yet have eyes to see or courage to hope for. May our love and our labors now echo your love and your labors, O Lord. Give our council men and women wisdom, courage, and patience to serve in sacrificial love, and strengthen them in their calling. Now shape our hearts, now guide our hands, now build your city. In your Son's precious name we pray. Amen.
Now our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Gears, could you please call the roll?
Mrs. Franzen.
Here.
Mrs. Hoover.
Here.
Ms. Royce.
Here.
Mr. Kelsch.
Here.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here. All members present. Moving on to amendment of agenda. This evening we have two items. We have standing reports, standing committees of council reports. Mrs. Hoover has a housing committee report, and also Mrs. Hoover has a law and ordinance committee report. I'd like to add those under item I. May I have a motion, please? Mrs. Franzen.
I move that we add the stated amendments to the agenda.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen. May I have a second? Mrs. Royce.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Royce. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item F, minutes of previous meetings. We have three meetings. First one is June 14th, 2022. The second one is June 16th, 2022, a special meeting. And the third one is June 17th, 2022, also a special meeting. Yes.
We move that we receive and file the minutes.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file the minutes. May I have a second?
For all three.
For all three, sir?
All three, yes.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to public hearings. This evening we have a public hearing of the 2023 tax budget for the city of Norwood, Ohio. I hereby call this public hearing to order. To begin the public hearing, I would like to ask anyone that would like to speak in favor of the measure to please come forward, state your name.
Bishop Sonny James. Just want to commend the work that has gone into the oversight of finances and the expenditures of our financial situation, especially given the history and all that we've been through over the last several years. So for all of those that had a part in it, nothing's ever 100% like we would want something, but I want to commend those that have worked on this. Jim Stith does an awesome job, along with all of the others that work on it. So I just want to say thank you for considering those things that are really important to the residents of our community.
Anyone else that would like to speak in favor? If not, is there anyone that would like to speak against the measure? So we have no one else to speak, then we'll go ahead and we'll close this public hearing. I hereby close this public hearing. Moving on to item H, request to address council. This evening, we have Bishop Sonny James. It's the only request we have this evening.
Bishop Sonny James, 1830 Hopkins Avenue here in Norwood. Want to just real briefly tonight, I've been so excited over the last month or so. My son, Lemuel, was in Paris Island for Marine boot camp training, and we were able to go there and spend time with him and bring him back home for 10 days. And we barely saw our son over those 10 days, as you can imagine. But it was so really heartwarming to hear all of his comrades complimenting him. And I'll never forget that he gave a compliment to Norwood and some of the experiences that he shared with coming through the Junior Police Academy or Explorers and the JPA prior to that. And it was just wonderful to hear everyone saying that they may not have made it through had it not been for him. And so I just want to compliment our chief, who, when Lemuel came back, Lieutenant Hicks, invited my son to come over to the new academy, and he was able to speak to the new recruits that are going into the JPA. And so I wanted to just compliment on bringing that program back, because now, as my son will serve as a U.S. Marine, he was able to come back and share, and just to see the joy in his eye again, talking about his community of Norwood, really warmed my heart. And then we really owe you all, and I say we, I'm speaking people of color. Recently we celebrated Juneteenth right here in Norwood, and I want to commend each and every one of you who had a vote to make that a reality. That is just extremely awesome, and it's not a matter of whether one person shows up or 1,000. It's the fact that we honor and we acknowledge something that means so much to people of color in this community. Again, given the long history and the perception that other people outside of our community has, for us to come together and all of you collectively make the right call. So we look forward again next year to celebrate Black History Month as we did this past year, and some of you celebrated with us, and then also the late great Dr. Martin Luther King doing those marches and parades coming up in the future. So that's all I have tonight. It's been a journey. My life hasn't been the same since December the 12th, and so I'm just grateful to be standing, and I'm really, really liking the direction that I'm seeing us as a community. For the residents listening, if you haven't been down to Waterworks, I was blown away today. I took one of the swimmers, picked him up, and he said he had a swim meet at 5:30, so I said, well, hop in, I'll take you. And I got down there, and the first thing I said was, my God, that looks good. So again, we're just little things, just small things. But when you look at it and you say, man, now that's getting the butter from the duck. So I want to just commend those of you who had a hand in that, just beautifying our community. Nice to see that our recreation department is up and running. They recently announced that another church is going to move into the space where our church used to rent, and we commend them and applaud them on that. Just keep up working together. That's the big thing, and people like me can see it, and I'm proud when I now can look at people and say, man, we're making great strides. And that's the God's honest truth, guys. We're making great strides. And so I pray that the rest of this year, as I come before you, I'll be able to just applaud all of you and just celebrate you for the wonderful work that you guys are doing, because we are working together. We are doing great things. And, you know, I tell my older sons, I look forward for them to step into you guys' seat, you guys' roles, and to be a part of their community at the highest level. And so appreciate all of you guys for working so hard at making our community more diverse, more culturally acceptable, and we look forward to starting our Hearing Every Perspective soon, and pray that you all will prioritize and come out. God bless you.
Thank you, Bishop James. Next, we move on to item I, reports of standing committees of council. Mrs. Hoover.
Yes, thank you. I have two. To the Honorable Committee of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Law, Ordinance, and Human Resources, to whom was referred Cruelty to Companion Animal Ordinance and Impounding of Vehicles Redemption, beg leave to submit the following report. Amend companion animal to remove temperatures is not necessary per the dog warden, reference dog warden duties and barking ordinance, and change parking time from 48 hours to 72 hours to be in alignment with the parking ordinance. The meeting minutes are attached. Respectfully submitted, Susan Hoover, Eric Thompson, and Alexis Royce.
Mr. Thompson.
Move that we receive and file the report.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file the report. Ms. Royce.
Second.
Second by Ms. Royce. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen,
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover,
Yes.
Ms. Royce,
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch,
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Hoover.
Thank you. The Housing, Health, and Public Safety. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Housing, Health, and Public Safety, to whom was referred the Housing Action Plan, beg leave to submit the following report. The discussion of the Housing Action Plan with further exploration of ways to increase housing stock options, financial supports, network of community support, and code enforcement. This item is continuing to stay in committee, and minutes are attached. Respectfully submitted, Susan Hoover, Candace Winterbauer, and Alexis Royce.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoover. Mr. Thompson.
I move that we receive and file both the report and the minutes.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and refile the report and the minutes. Ms. Winterbauer.
Second?
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen,
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover,
Yes.
Ms. Royce,
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch,
Mr. Kelsch. We're calling the roll.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Mrs. Winterbauer,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item K, second reading of ordinances. K1, ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and to enter into a contract to upgrade part of the Norwood Police Division building to improve a women's locker room and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Franson.
I'd like to move that we suspend the rules and have the second and third readings tonight.
Motion by Mrs. Franson to suspend the rules and have the second and third reading. Mrs. Hoover.
I second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen,
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover,
Yes.
Ms. Royce,
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch,
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. May we have the second and third reading?
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and to enter into a contract to upgrade part of the Norwood Police Division building to improve a women's locker room and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and to enter into a contract to upgrade part of the Norwood Police Division building to improve a women's locker room and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Move that we pass the ordinance, please.
Motion by Mr. Braden to pass the ordinance. Mr. Kelch.
Second that.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item K2, ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a lease of a portion of the Donald E. Pruse Community Center to the Azalea Montessori School and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Hoover.
I make a motion that we suspend the rules and have the second and third reading.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover to suspend the rules and have the second and third reading. Mrs. Franzen.
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Franzen. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
May we have the second and third reading?
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a lease of a portion of the Donald E. Pruse Community Center to the Azalea Montessori School and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a lease of a portion of the Donald E. Pruse Community Center to the Azalea Montessori School and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Winterbauer.
Motion to pass the ordinance?
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mrs. Hoover.
I second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any further discussion? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to vote no on this ordinance tonight. I just want to briefly explain why. And I hope that other people here consider this.
Can we turn off the air so I can't hear him?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the mics or the speakers are even on because I couldn't hear anybody. So,
I just want to be able to hear you.
so
Thank
thank you, Mr. Powers. So the reason we voted no on this is because it's a private school. It's not like, it's Norwood Schools or whatever, but Norwood Schools is currently working on their own Montessori program that they've been working on for a while. They use tax dollars, obviously, for our residents, for our students and all that stuff. This school essentially pulls the same kind of tax money from the state. I think, in my opinion, that if we vote yes to support this, we are pretty much entering into like a legal document to essentially partner with them, and it's binding to them. When I don't think that's appropriate for our city to do that, when Norwood Schools is currently building their own Montessori program. I was asking Mr. Powers briefly, and I'm sure he can stand up and speak on it as well. If any of us have reached out to the school board, the superintendent, anybody at Norwood City Schools to kind of get their idea on this, their thoughts, and if they support it, or kind of any information they would have or feedback they would have as well, since they are the key pillar in our city for education. And Mr. Powers is saying that he hasn't spoken to anybody. So yeah, I'm not going to go ahead and I'm not going to support this lease signing because I don't think the city should enter into agreement with them. And they should, if anything, support the Norwood City Public Schools and their venture on a Montessori program.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Anyone else? Any further discussion? The motion on the floor is by Mrs. Hoover to suspend the rules. I'm sorry, Mrs. Winterbauer, to pass the ordinance. Second by Mrs. Hoover. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
No.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present voting aye. We have. Well, we have all members present voting. We had six
Yes.
ayes and 1 no. Easy for
got
me to
it.
say. Thank you, Mr. Gears. Motion passes. Ordinance passes. There you go. Moving on to item K3, an ordinance for the city of Norwood to apply for, accept, and enter into a water supply revolving loan account, WSRLA, agreement for construction of water facilities, and designating a dedicated repayment source for the loan and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Franzen.
I move that we suspend the rules and have the second and third readings of this tonight.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to suspend the rules and have the second and third reading. Mrs. Winterbauer.
I second.
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
Yeah, not much discussion, so much as clarification for those that might be watching. I'm hoping I'm not wrong with this. This is in part so that we can take the Norwood water towers out of active commission. So this supports that endeavor by adding extra pumping stations so that residents do not lose pressure, which has been an issue for some residents on Indian Mound. So just wanted to say that out loud so people know what this water loan is actually about.
Thank you, Mrs. Franzen. Anyone else? Mr. Kelch.
Could we maybe hear from the Safety Service Director or the mayor on this for more insight and on what this actually is?
Mr. Powers?
Yes, Councilwoman Franzen is correct that it is to take the towers off. So part of that is an EPA mandate to get those towers offline. So this loan would pay for that portion of it. It would also help to do some connections of the water lines so that we have additional links, if that makes sense, so that the water is flowing from more directions to more parts of the city. So it will improve flow for fire response in that area, as they have to get water out of one of the fire hydrants. And it will increase the circulation of water, so you'll actually see better quality water in the Norwood system with this upgrade.
Anyone else? Any questions for Mr. Powers? Mr. Braden?
Thank you, Mr. President. Assuming that this bill will be paid through the Water Department Fund?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden.
Thank you.
Anyone else for Mr. Powers? Thank you, sir. We have a motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen to suspend the rules and have a
Nope.
second
Oh, yeah, sorry.
and third reading, seconded by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. May we have the second and third reading?
A resolution authorizing the City of Norwood to apply for, accept, and enter into a water supply revolving loan account, WSRLA, agreement for construction of water facilities, and designating a dedicated repayment source for the loan and declaring an emergency. A resolution authorizing the City of Norwood to apply for, accept, and enter into a water supply revolving loan account, WSRLA agreement for construction of water facilities, and designating a dedicated repayment source for the loan and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Kears. Mrs. Winterbauer.
Motion to pass the resolution?
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer to pass the resolution. Ms. Royce.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Royce. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. Resolution passes. Moving on to item L, introductory readings of ordinances and resolutions. L1, ordinance making permanent appropriations for the expenditures of the City of Norwood, Ohio for the calendar year ending in December 31st, 2022, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
Would move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mr. Braden.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yep.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. May we have all three readings?
Ordinance making permanent appropriations for the expenditures of the City of Norwood, Ohio for the calendar year ending December 31, 2022, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance making permanent appropriations for the expenditures of the City of Norwood, Ohio for the calendar year ending December 31, 2022, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance making permanent appropriations for the expenditures of the City of Norwood, Ohio for the calendar year ending December 31, 2022, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Braden.
Move we pass the resolution.
Motion by Mr. Braden to pass the resolution.
Ordinance.
I'm sorry, ordinance.
Ordinance. My apologies.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Okay, second?
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item L2, ordinance amending section 505.071 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Cruelty to Companion Animals. Mrs. Hoover.
I make a motion that we have the introductory reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover to have the first reading.
Yes, please, thank you.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
I second?
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance amending Section 505.071 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Cruelty to Companion Animals.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Moving on to item L3, ordinance amending Section 303.08 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Impounding of Vehicles, Redemption, and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Winterbauer.
Motion, we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mrs. Franzen.
I second?
Second by Mrs. Franzen. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance amending Section 303.08 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Impounding of Vehicles, Redemption, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance amending Section 303.08 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Impounding of Vehicles, Redemption, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance amending Section 303.08 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Impounding of Vehicles, Redemption, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mrs. Hoover.
I move we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover to pass the ordinance. Mrs. Winterbauer.
I second?
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
No.
We have 6 ayes, 1 no. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item M, administrative reports. Mayor Snyder.
Thank you. There's just so much going on in the city right now. There's so many, it's interesting to think just, a couple of years ago, we were all shut down. And it seems like after COVID and after everything opened back up, we have roared back to life, absolutely roared. Looking at the calendar, in June, we had the dedication of the firefighter Plogman Memorial sign. We had the rededication of the J.B. Worth Memorial Pool. And some of you weren't there, but J.B. Worth was a recreation director for the city of Norwood for 30 years. And he was actually the recreation director when some big changes occurred, like the sports complex, the Waterworks Sports Complex, and the pool was named in a memorial to him. He passed away from a heart attack at his home, cutting grass, about a year before all of this finalized, but all of his work is the work that you see. Shea Stadium and all of that work was something that he did as a dedicated city employee. I'd wondered as a kid, when they said it was the J.B. Worth pool, as a kid, I'd think, who's J.B. Worth? I did a little research when we did the 50th anniversary rededication, and he was pretty impressive, the service that he put into our community. And I think it's worthwhile to keep his name in mind, because there are so many public servants that get just a little bit of recognition, and he deserved a lot of recognition. So the Juneteenth celebration went on. Virginia Perkins coordinated that, and I think it went very well. I wasn't able to be there, but I saw pictures, and Kim was there, and it looked like there was a good crew. Just had Linda Brim. Linda Brim has been active in our community for so many years, and they just celebrated one of her birthdays, and there was they asked for a proclamation, and we did a proclamation, and Virginia Perkins took care of that one. We just, prior to the meeting tonight, we swore in 6 new officers, swore in a new sergeant and a lieutenant. So we've got some changes. We definitely have changes going on in our departments. Our police department is a young, motivated police department, and I think they're doing good work out there. Jumping back to things to do in the city, I've looked at my calendar. I mean, for all the good and the bad of Facebook, you can find all sorts of things to do in the city of Norwood right now. July 1st at Waterworks, just looking at this, and this is from the Norwood Together site, I think. It is the Norwood Together production, but on July 1st is Military Night at Waterworks from 5 to 8. Then there's a mega party in the park at Doral Field on the 2nd from 12 to 3, and then July 4th is the fireworks at Shea Stadium. And, it would be different if I thought, well, then Play and Learn at the library is coming up on the 8th. On the 9th is the Norwood Carnival at the library. There's STEM the library's involved. The Baby Bear's going on at Graith Mess. It's interesting because you looking at all these events, these are not city-ran events. Waterworks is the swim pool. That's our recreation area. But there's a lot of events that are occurring. The fireworks that go on, there is zero City of Norwood taxpayer money for those fireworks. The events that all these churches are put on are free to the public, open and free, and we enjoy so much from them. I mean, if we talk about the amenities and all the different fun things that you can do in the city of Norwood compared to just 5 years ago, it's phenomenal. And the activation, the people that are volunteering their time and treasure is sometimes time away from your family, but sometimes it's time with your family, having fun at these events. We are just sitting on it's a beehive of activity. She likes a beehive of activity of fun. So, and I can't speak highly enough about all the different people that have gotten involved and that are helping make it happen. So I really do appreciate it. There's a lot of work going on with streets. There's, Public Works is busy. I mean, there's so much going on with Public Works on a regular basis. So I just really commend the staff that's doing such hard work, and then all the volunteers, all those efforts. I mean, the market was just held last weekend, and hopefully some of you were there and were able to look at the safety lane building. We had the garage doors open on the safety lane building, so you could get a look at that building, and we're going to start working on reactivating that and figuring out where we're going with that. Robert, who's the city's custodian and does just a ton of work, has done a lot of work getting things out of there and getting it cleaned up. So there's so much potential there. The quality of people who ask what's going on with Quality Inn, it's up for auction. The owners of it have actually put it up for auction. So we'll see how that goes, because if it goes into the right hands, we'll see some progress there. So there's just a ton going on. Appreciate just a few minutes to talk about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Any questions or comments for Mayor Schneider? Thank you again. Moving on to item N, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's just a reminder to put out that tomorrow, Wednesday, June 29th, 7:30 PM, we'll be having our town hall meeting on the Elm Avenue Storm Sewer Project. And that'll be at the Norwood Community Center, down in the basement area where they have other meetings and the tables and the kitchenette and stuff.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any other unfinished business this evening? Then we'll move on to new business. Any new business? Mrs. Hoover.
I have a couple of things. First is sort of tied into old business. I want to again thank Virginia Patterson for all of her efforts with the Juneteenth event and the power of one individual making some pretty dramatic change in a community, so that's really exciting. Following that, there's going to be a pop-up event, pop-up Pride event tomorrow, Wednesday, at Victory Park at 6:30, and another resident is putting that together. There's going to be balloons and chalk and general family-friendly celebration, so I encourage people to come out to that. Also, the dedication for Sergeant Anthony Overberg will be on July 8th at 6. I guess we're going to have another meeting before then, but the ceremony will take place at the corner of Cortland and Franklin. Another thing, the library is having free snacks and shelf-stable meals Monday through Friday from 6:30 to 4. So kids can go in, anyone 18 and under can go in and get that. And then finally, you can hear my voice shaking. I really feel it's important that we acknowledge the Supreme Court's recent ruling to overturn Roe v. Wade. I have myself some strongly held personal beliefs about a woman's autonomy over her body and medical decisions, and I'm deeply disappointed by the ruling. This in particular will disproportionately impact women of color and women of low income. Others have differing views, some as tightly held as mine, and I respect that. While I continue to work for equity and access for all, I do invite people to come where we can agree. Ways to reduce unplanned pregnancies and supportive services for those who would not have otherwise chosen parenting. As an elected official, I have an obligation to my residents that I represent the people who've elected me while still remaining true to my personal convictions. Research shows that we can reduce unwanted pregnancies through education, mutual respect, and empowerment. We also need to support women who have unplanned pregnancies by providing low-income housing, genuine education, career opportunities, health care, housing, services for disabled children, and other basic supports so that they will have the resources that they need to fulfill the serious obligation of parenting. I believe it is through those acts of moral obligation and compassion that we will ultimately define ourselves. I would like to put this topic in the Health, Housing, and Public Safety Committee for further discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Hoover. Any other new business this evening? Mr. Thompson.
I'm going to be calling a Finance Committee meeting next week, although I don't have a date yet because I need to talk with Mr. Stith about his availability, and he's not here. But I did want people on the committee to look out for that. I'll try to get in touch with him in the next day or two and get a time nailed down. But we'll be discussing some claims that we've got as well as our then and now process. So I'll get that to everybody as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Anyone else? Mrs. Franzen.
I just want to echo Mrs. Hoover's general tenor and dissatisfaction with the Roe versus Wade ruling recently. I apologize. The reason I'm wearing this mask is I had COVID last week, so my thoughts are a bit scattered right now, and I wanted to also say something to the same effect as Mrs. Hoover, and she said it much more better. See, much better than I ever could. So I hope that we, as a city, can do what we can to help women in our city and in the surrounding areas that are dealing with the fallout of this. So yes, I also have a zit, so it's kind of nice. Got the mask on. On a lighter note. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to Military Night, there is a Wind Down Wednesday tomorrow, the first of 3, where you can come have some wine, You can also whine to other people about various things. I know I will be. That is at 5, so my plan for tomorrow is to go to that, have a drink or two, go to the Pride event, and then go to the Elm Avenue public hearing. It's going to be a busy day with a lot of different emotions. So, again, I'm sorry. I'm still kind of sick. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Frenzen. Any other new business? Then we'll move on to,
If I might, we've had an offer by one of the litigants in some pending lawsuits that we've got going to settle, and I'd like to go into executive session to discuss that.
Mr. Gears and I discussed that. We're going to do it right after communications.
That's fine.
If that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gary. Then we'll move on to item P, communications from Jim Stith, Auditor, regarding the May financial reports.
Dear council members, this letter is to let you know that the May monthly financial reports were emailed to each council member on June 16th. If you have not received said email, please let me know so that I can verify your email address and get a copy of the reports to you as well. Sincerely, Kim Dallas, Account Clerk, Auditor's Office.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Braden.
Motion to receive and file the letter.
Motion by Mr. Braden to receive and file the letter. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. Motion passes. Mr. Braden.
Thank you. I'd like to make a motion that we enter into executive session to discuss pending litigation.
Motion by Mr. Braden to move into executive session regarding pending litigation. Mr. Thompson.
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. We are in executive session. We are out of executive session. Moving on to item R, adjournment. May I have a motion for adjournment? Mrs. Winterbauer.
Motion for adjournment?
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer. Do I have a second? Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes, and we are adjourned.